Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, this episode is about US President Donald Trump's South and West Asia policies. I use the word policy for want of a better word because policy presumes certain determinants, a process, some discernible criteria, something which is structural, which can be analyzed. That's generally not the case with Mr. Trump, who is given to repetitive lexicon of superlatives and vivid descriptors and adjectival extravaganza, if you will. Greatest deal in the history of deals, greatest peace in 3,000 years, with the hottest country in the world. I inherited the biggest mess in the history of this country, etc., etc. But I'll try to see if there's some structure that I can get Elizabeth Threlkeld, my guest for this episode, to figure out. Threlkeld is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Her research interests include nuclear competition in Southern Asia, regional security dynamics, and geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific. Before joining Stimson, she served as a Foreign Service officer with the US Department of State in Islamabad and, yes, Peshawar in Pakistan and Monterrey in Mexico. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it. Let me begin with something that Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist. I'm talking about the Federalist number 70. And he argued in favor of an executive office comprising one person. And the argument was that unitary structure would provide energy in the executive. Energy in the executive, as quotes from what he wrote. And which for him is, again, a quote from him, leading character in the definition of good government. Now, these qualities he directly associated with this unity energy relationship, because they kind of impact on decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch. So it's a structural feature of sorts of the second branch of government, which would seem to make the identity of the president rather important. Now, I think this is like early last year, I had your namesake, part of your namesake, Professor Elizabeth Saunders on my program, who's written the book in Leaders at War. And she kind of reverses the long-standing bias against personal agency. And she actually argued for the significance of the individual leader when it comes to decisions to intervene militarily. But overall, it's not just about, because her book focused on the military side of things, but overall generally. So in a way, she kind of joins Hamilton in arguing that it matters who is president. Now you have a president who really matters. I was just watching him, I think last night, probably, or early morning today, I forget, when MBS was at the White House. And there was an ABC reporter who asked him a question about Epstein and also asked a question about Khashoggi. And Trump just lashed out at her, called her a crappy reporter who doesn't know how to do a job, and ABC, fake news, this thing. And so we're dealing with someone who it's very difficult to structure your world around him. So given that background, what do you make of his approach to South Asia/West Asia?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's wonderful to see you, Ejaz, and looking forward to the conversation. I think it is pretty remarkable how much U.S. policy towards the region has shifted over the course of the last 10, 11 months. And the questions that I think are top of mind here in Washington among those of us who do our best to track the region is one of sustainability, right? How long the trends that we're seeing in this new administration's foreign policy are going to last? Is it going to be more of a reversion to the norm over time? Or is this indeed a meaningful diversions, and one that will continue at least for the remaining years of the second Trump term. And the longer that it goes on, I think the odds shift more in favor of this being more of a meaningful transition, a meaningful change. And, I do think it is difficult to argue with the centrality of the individual in leadership positions, not just in the US, but indeed elsewhere in Pakistan and India right now, right? This is something that I think is not unique to Washington or to the US right now. And I think that global context is really important to keep in mind, because one of the things, as we see, right, I should say explicitly, like, I focus on South Asia. So even though I live in Washington and do my best to understand what's happening here, analytically, I spend most of my time working on the region. And I think in the region, too, we can see there's been work historically done over time looking at the role that individual leaders can play, be it they on the civilian side, on the military side, and the lack of veto players within the system, right? And I think this feels like a moment internationally where there are fewer veto players, and where there is perhaps a reassessment of what have been the primary underlying priorities in the United States, certainly in kind of the post 9/11 moment, to be sure. And with all of that, I think the other dynamic to keep in mind here is how much of this is driven more by kind of a redefinition of what constitute U.S. interests, and more of a focus on domestic imperatives rather than a China-centric approach to the region. With the recent summit that we saw, I think there's still some question marks over what this administration's China policy is going to look like. And with that, we find ourselves in a little bit of flux, where that China imperative has been really the driving emphasis of so much of policy in South Asia, where it's felt like South Asia policy is almost symptomatic of that broader China focus. And so if indeed we're seeing perhaps a shift away from that to more of a domestic focus, more of just a different way of viewing U.S. interests and threats, then it makes logical sense that South Asia policy would also evolve. But I think the thing to emphasize here is we're still less than a year in, and a whole lot can change in the remaining years of this president's term. And so while, yes, it is quite remarkable how far U.S. policy seems to have shifted, it is still an open question how long this will be our course, or indeed whether there's going to be a course correction at some point.
Okay. I'm going to flag this point that you raised with reference to strong leaders, not just in the US, but also elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But before I get to that, let me ask you a quick question, quick response, and then we'll proceed from there. So for as many years that I have looked at things, there have been multiple number of think tanks, people who kind of work at the think tanks, go to the administrations, return to the think tanks, and there's been a sort of interactive dynamics, if you will, between the Beltway think tanks and various administrations over the years. But are the Beltway think tanks now even matter in terms of their relevance to what's happening in the White House?
I think it depends on the issue. It depends on the think tank. It depends on the individual, because so much of it is relationship based. And I will say that, while certainly the White House is dominating the foreign policy landscape here in a way that I think is quite distinct from previous administrations, there is still whole, interagency functions in Washington, and I think those relationships still matter too. And so even though what's happening in the West Wing and the Oval Office is driving the headlines, it is still important to continue engaging with and to recognize kind of the institutional forces that are still there within government carrying out these policies, right? And so in thinking about impact, it will not surprise you that this is a question that, has come up. And where I've come down on this question, and maybe what is somewhat distinct about at least our program, is our focus is just as much, if not more, in the region itself than here in Washington, and thinking about how to play a bridging role to an extent, right? How can we leverage the greater flexibility and access that we have the luxury of having, and particularly our focus on next generation analysts, and really trying to keep an ear to the ground and understand what's happening as best we can, and finding ways of translating that into the discussion here in Washington. And I think vice versa, right? What is happening in Washington can be somewhat inscrutable. And so doing our best to help to make that more legible for the region, I think that's where the sweet spot is at the moment.
Yeah, well, I deliberately put you in choppy waters, but you've navigated them. This is because of your FSO background, very different. But let me press this point a little. So yes, the Sherpas are doing their job. The job requires multiple, small little things, the nitty gritty, the minutiae. The think tanks are also doing that. You're doing the reports. You're dealing with South Asia. You obviously linked up with people here. You're talking to them. You're getting them to write stuff. You're putting out reports and the rest of it. The issue is, and the reason I ask this question is, given my own experience as someone who was at the Brookings Institution from September 2002 through August 2003. And for instance, I saw how the Saban Center was very active, in fact, proactive. This was when Martin Indyk was heading the Saban Center, in terms of influencing the Bush administration's policy towards the invasion of Iraq. Right? And I can testify to the fact that Brookings played a very important and very significant role in terms of influencing that policy. I won't go into the details, but take my word for that. But you can do your own investigation, and that what I'm saying is right. I do not see that kind of thing happening with this administration. As a matter of fact, this administration, that's the second avatar of Mr. Trump, is where he has brought people, for the most part, leaving aside people like Marco Rubio and a few others, brought with him people who haven't traditionally been part of the policy-making elite. So from where I stand, I don't see that the think tanks, despite all the work all the Sherpas are doing and the rest of it, that has a major impact on Mr. Trump's policies.
I think, first of all, I obviously can't speak to a Brookings role back in the day, though.
No, you don't have to. I was just giving you my ringside view of what was happening then. I've written about it, so it's not something that I'm talking about for the first time. And so I said that you can do your own investigations to find out that what I've said is actually factually correct. So we don't have to specific. We don't. That was just an example. We don't have to specifically link the conversation to that.
I think it's a new world. I think so much has changed, certainly since then, but even just in the last few years, the last 11 months, we've all had to get a little bit more creative to understand how decision-making is evolving. And I think we can get overly set in our ways in thinking that, there is a quote unquote foreign policy elite and there's this revolving door and all of that. I think I am a firm believer in the importance of expertise, but I think there are also different kinds of expertise that have a seat at the table now in a way that perhaps they didn't and that they should have, right? So here I think about the business community, for example, and in conversations around trade impacts and trade potential in South Asia, thinking about critical minerals and those investments, right? This is perhaps by virtue of background and administration that is quite focused on investments and using economic leverage as a tool of foreign policy in a way that feels quite novel. And so in order to better understand and kind of seek to inform those decisions, you have to expand your ambit and who you're talking to. And I think the same would be true in the region as well. You're missing the story if, you go to Islamabad and Delhi and visit the think tanks, but don't have conversations outside of those spaces. And so I think the challenge for all of us right now is to ensure that we're getting as fulsome a picture as possible of who those players are. And also just recognizing the new connective tissue that exists, right? It is entirely easier for us to sit here and have a virtual conversation between Lahore and DC in a way that wasn't possible before. And so I think with that, there are new connections that are available, but it also limits whatever monopoly that used to exist among those of us who work formally on foreign policy. So there's just a lot more connections and a lot more players at the table right now.
Yeah. Okay, so let me assail it from another angle, which is that over the last almost 30 years, or certainly a quarter century, 25 years, whatever, number of years one wants to put on this, there was a deliberate effort in DC to promote India, and not because India did not deserve it. They were progressing and the rest of it, and the diaspora was highly qualified. They were doing lots of right things and the rest of it. And Pakistan was obviously the same kind of ratio, kind of becoming less important. As a matter of fact, during President Biden's tenure, 4 years, no one really talked about Pakistan and DC, except in terms that weren't particularly favorable to Pakistan. Now, and last time, as a matter of fact, when the first Trump 1.0, Pakistan wasn't particularly Mr. Trump's darling by any stretch of the imagination. And then suddenly, I won't even say from Jan this year, I would say from May 7th this year, suddenly something has happened. And I would want to get your take on this. I have my own take on it, but I want to get your take on this. And it seems that the entire structural, edifice on which multiple people and multiple administrations had worked, to the extent of changing Asia-Pacific's nomenclature to Indo-Pacific and talking about India as a net security provider, blah, 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 to now where India and Brazil are the only two states with 50% tariffs, while Mr. Trump talks about my favorite field marshal and the rest of it. So what exactly is going on? I mean, I want to get your perspective.
Yeah. It's certainly been a remarkable shift. And I would actually say that there were indications of this as early as that speech to the joint session of Congress that President Trump gave, where Pakistan actually received a shout out for its quick action against the Abbey Gate conspirator. And I think that was the first public sense that something was different. To your point, it is difficult to imagine a similar statement coming from President Biden, for example. And with that, I think one thing that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has benefited from is that the bar was so low, right? This was not the time of heightened expectations and mismatched expectations that we saw in the war on terror days, because there was a great deal of focus on Pakistan at the time. So it's not that that kind of period of lull went back too far into the past, but the challenge was the relationship was itself determined by an external party, external factor in the war in Afghanistan. And certainly there were a great deal of frustrations that emerged on both sides, but particularly in this town over the course of the war effort in Afghanistan. And I think after the 4 years of the Biden administration, and particularly with President Trump coming in with really a new slate of advisors who don't carry as much of that baggage, it produced an opening. But certainly Pakistan has played its cards well, and has tried to position itself as a willing partner in whatever priorities are coming out of Washington, right? And it's also just, I think, been fortunate to be able to make that case in kind of a nimble and new way. So thinking about critical minerals, thinking about crypto, these are conversations that just didn't carry as much water previously. I will say I have, just a degree of healthy skepticism in terms of the durability of some of that, particularly as we're seeing tensions building between Afghanistan and Pakistan and what that means for the viability of a lot of this. But nonetheless, to Pakistan's credit, right, it has positioned itself as a partner. I think the other piece here is this administration's focus on the Middle East and the role that we understand Pakistan to have played in that process, certainly having a seat at the table in Sharm el-Sheikh and what just played out at the UNSC. So Pakistan has been a player and has worked to support the administration's priorities in a meaningful way. And I think that matters and has been recognized. On the other side of the ledger, I think the U.S.-India relationship suffered from almost the inverse, where expectations for continued support and partnership were so high after multiple administrations kind of building momentum along those lines, that this has been a particularly challenging period because of those mismatched expectations. And I do think that the May 7th crisis truly played a role here. And I think my concern is that even if we are to see a trade deal that is eventually reached, as I think we actually will, right? I think 50% tariffs are not going to be with us forever. We're seeing reporting that India has begun to meaningfully limit its purchase of Russian oil, for example, which under threat of sanctions, of course, but that could take away the 25% penalty. And there's a lot of work going on. We see just headlines behind the scenes of trying to reach an agreement. So there's that. And I think that could take a major irritant out. But there's still a number of other issues in the relationship that, to my mind, had never risen to the level of intensity and focus that we're seeing now, in part because of different administration priorities. And coming back to what I was saying about the centrality of the China threat to previous administrations, the security imperative had been more significant in kind of the world views of past administrations. And so when you add those things up and you have the challenge of the crisis and the very differential approach that both sides took to recognizing the U.S. role in the ceasefire, I think there are hurt feelings on both sides, and that is a challenging dynamic to work through. Personally, I hope we can get to a point, and I see it as not impossible, where actually the US can have workable relationships with both India and Pakistan at the same time. And thinking about that as perhaps a goal that is not isn't something that we've seen in recent memory, but to my mind would have benefits. And so coming back to what I was mentioning earlier, just in terms of how sustainable, how enduring is this likely to be, I think the jury is still out. But for Pakistan's perspective, this is a golden opportunity to double down on some of the meaningful reforms that are going to put Pakistan in a position to best leverage the geopolitical tailwind that it's enjoying for the first time in quite some time.
Yeah. Well, a couple of observations with reference, for instance, to Ep78. Pakistan had made it very clear to the Biden administration that they are going to support the over-the-horizon capabilities. So this is not peculiar. That cooperation is not peculiar to the Trump administration. Has been going on for ever since the Taliban entered Kabul. And I think it's one of those points that the Taliban have actually come up with now in terms of whatever grievances, quote unquote grievances, that they have against us. But I agree with you that structurally, because the Indians they have their back channels open with the Trump administration. My own sense is that one of the sticking points basically is, again, it's about the personality of the leaders on both sides. Mr. Trump wants Modi to kiss the ring, and I think Modi is not particularly agreeable to that proposition. That phone call where President Trump wanted him to make a pit stop and basically wanted him to sit down with the field marshal was something that would have been political suicide for Mr. Modi back home. I'm not so sure if President Trump will be able to get the two sides together, because unfortunately the Indian side has, it's now a policy that's been publicly stated of cutting Pakistan loose and making all of this into a zero-sum game. So I'm not sure how it's going to play out that way. But let me ask you this. You said, and I'm not, I think I agree with you there, that a lot of this is not structured, it's personality driven. So there are question marks about sustainability. For instance, you talked about the Middle East. Now, the UNSC resolution, which Pakistan has voted yes on, but which Hamas and PIJ and other groups have rejected, is going to make it extremely difficult for Pakistan to become a part of this so-called international stabilization force. So we have a problem there. And it depends on how Pakistan and the US are going to balance these things out. There is a likelihood of, because for the Pakistani government to take a decision which actually sends a force, which can then get pitted against the Palestinian resistance, and also perhaps against the Zionist occupation forces, is going to be a real act of tightrope walking. I mean, I have to use a stronger expression than that, but this is the only one that comes to my mind right now. So you think that is something that could throw a spanner in the works?
I will say here is where I find myself a South Asia analyst and less a Middle East analyst. So
I'm not focusing. I'm not asking you to analyze the Middle East. I'm just saying that in terms of the discrepancies, expectations, in terms of the White House expectations, and in terms of what, for instance, Pakistan can deliver on this particular issue. So
Yeah. I don't think we know enough yet. I can see certainly a way that wouldn't be an impossible needle to thread.
Okay.
But I don't think we know enough, or at least I don't know enough in the open source world of exactly how that force is likely to come together, what
Yeah,
the
no one
ways that
knows.
are going to be, right? There's so many question marks here. And so I do think that recognizing this, though, as um, a potential challenge that the two sides are working up to, I would hope that there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes, and particularly in Pakistan, um, to get a little bit creative and see where those opportunities lie. I think Pakistan has been very supportive of the effort so far. But the devil is always in the details. And
Yeah.
so figuring out how to balance the international priorities and domestic concerns, it will be a challenge. I think there's
Yeah.
no two ways around it.
Let's fly back to South Asia, and specifically to India.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there has been some significant change in the way Washington looks at India? Or do you think it's a bump in the road, and maybe after 3 years or whatever, a year, 2 years, things are going to return to where the US-India relations were? And let me just add
Yeah.
that you have already raised this very important point with reference to US-China relations.
Yeah.
And so, do you think that's also going to impact how the US approaches India?
Yes and no. Kind of the big picture here seems to me to be that there is still a lot of latent support here in Washington for
Oh
the
yeah,
US and
that I know. That you guys are the latent support.
India.
Let me say that. Yeah. Anyway, go on. That was just a semi-facetious comment.
Yeah, but I think, meaningfully so. But outside, again, kind of coming back to our earlier conversation, it's not just the think tank world shouting into the middle distance. It's business. It's recognizing the economic potential that exists there. It is the connectivity between the two sides. This is a really significant bump in the road, right? And the longer that it goes on, I think the more challenging the repair work is going to be. But perhaps one indication of this is looking to see how business and investment is continuing on despite kind of the political churn that's happening right now.
So there is a movement away from the security dimension of this,
Um,
uh, as a countervailing force to China, to more the Indian business market, right?
um, I think it's helping to backfill. And as we see how kind of the bigger picture security calculus of this administration comes to the fore, then we'll be able to fill in some of the blanks. We'll see if there is a belatedly convened Quad summit, for example. I think that's something to keep an eye on going forward, right? It didn't happen this calendar year. Are we going to get to a place where it does? But beyond that, though, and this is kind of where I come back to the reality that, yes, what happens in the White House matters, and matters more in this administration than it has in most. But that kind of working level cooperation that did get started over the course of the last several administrations, that's continuing in certain ways. And so,
No, of course, that will. I mean, for instance, the defense ministers meet, and extension,
yep.
10-year extension of the defense cooperation and the rest of it. All of that is there. But for instance, you mentioned Quad. I mean,
Mhm.
these multilaterals like Quad or AUKUS, frankly, from where I stand, and this is about a month ago, I had a conversation with a couple of Australian diplomats here. I was saying it's basically dead in the water. I mean, look at Quad. Quad was essentially, it wasn't even a US idea.
Mm,
It began with the
yeah.
late Shinzo Abe,
Yep.
right? And it was kind of, floating around
Mm,
until President Trump's first tenure,
mm,
where it suddenly got some kind of, uplift.
yeah.
And now President Trump doesn't seem bothered at all about Quad. I mean, he's not even going to that summit.
So I think it is still a question mark, right? And this is where I think the China piece of the equation really, really matters. And it might be that we see an evolution and maybe a narrowing of focus areas of the Quad. I think one of the challenges with the Quad is it had become kind of that drawer in your kitchen where you try to throw a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
And, I think it was time for a bit of a healthy pruning there. So in what form that goes forward, I think something will ultimately kind of be revived and come out of it. I don't think it will look something terribly close to the Quad of the Biden administration. But here I will be watching what happens regionally, what happens within the Indo-Pacific region, perhaps even without U.S. involvement, right? I think the Pakistan-Saudi defense agreement certainly comes to mind, albeit on the Western Asia side, where this is kind of middle powers coming together and backfilling some of this role. Is there a room for India, Australia, and Japan to revive their trilateral, for example? That flexibility, I think, is increasingly there. And more broadly within the region, of course, there's a great deal of hedging that's happening right now with so much uncertainty in terms of just kind of this bigger picture structure and where Washington and Beijing are going to come down.
Yeah, I'm interesting that you mentioned Australia, because notwithstanding what the Albanese government is talking about, now there are increasing voices within Australia, and particularly in Canberra, policy voices that are talking about this entire AUKUS deal and the fact that the Aussies are not going to get the Virginia class submarines. They have it's a huge $385 billion deal, which people are questioning. It was never put to Parliament. There was zero debate about it, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of skepticism about that. And tie that in with what you're talking about with reference to China and this G2 meeting. I mean, this term, just the US use of this term G2 is, as you know, is pretty significant. I mean, it's actually an acknowledgement of peer competition. I mean, that here is a power which is not just emerging or rising, it has risen, and the US has to deal with it. So there are a number of open questions that obviously neither of us has an answer to. But one final word with reference to the possibility of another conflict between India and Pakistan. And I say this because it's a stated policy by the Prime Minister of India, who's the chief executive, which is that Operation Sindoor has been paused. It's not over. That any quote unquote terrorist attack in occupied Kashmir will be automatically pinned on Pakistan, and India reserves the right. I mean, this is the narrative that it's not the Indian aggression against Pakistan, but that attack will be considered an aggression by Pakistan on India, and India is going to invoke the right to self defense. My question to you quickly is, given where things stand and what we have seen since May, how do you think, if in theory, if something like that happens, how do you think the White House is going to react to that?
Yeah. It's a good question, and one that I've spent an awful lot of time thinking about over the past few months, because I do worry quite a bit that we will see crisis recurrence in the not too distant future. I will say, before actually answering your question, that the recent terrible blast that we saw in Delhi is actually an interesting example of an area where, at least so far, the Indian government seems to be mainly pursuing the case through judicial channels, right? Treating it more as a law enforcement matter than something that would automatically trigger a cross-border action, for example. So, I think that is an interesting point here, and it gets back to whether attribution matters. And perhaps there's a bit of a silver lining lesson to be drawn that it still seems to the extent that we, information is still limited, but it's something to watch. Because I saw that news headline flash across and thought, my goodness, is are we off to the races again? But coming to your question, if there is a trigger of whatever sort that does result in kind of a continuation of Operation Sindoor, I would imagine that having this experience of working to manage this crisis, the White House would be quite focused on potential escalation and perhaps focused a little bit earlier on in the crisis than happened back in May, right? We saw several days of kind of tit for tat escalation, and the messaging was quite different. It was, this is none of our business. And then all of a sudden things kicked into gear. So I would have to imagine, based on nothing but my own surmising, that muscle memory would be in there in terms of the risks that are entailed in an India-Pakistan crisis. Now, where I think there is a risk is seeing what transpired between the US and India after that crisis. I worry about whether and how Delhi would be receptive to US efforts to manage that crisis, right? Like, fundamentally, are they going to pick up the phone? And to what extent would US leverage be diminished by virtue of what's played out in the months since? And so I think, to my mind, given what we saw this time of the centrality of the US role based on what's come out so far, it leaves me a little bit concerned, I will say, that either or both sides might be entering into a crisis working from the assumption that Washington would be able to be as effective in bringing an end to a crisis as it was this past time. And I think there are a few reasons why that might not be the case. And from that comes a really challenging kind of moral hazard issue of working under an assumption that those breaks that are there within the system will be there when they're needed. And simultaneously, to my mind, both sides seem to have learned lessons that are more on the order of how can we escalate more effectively? How can we get towards the battlefield gains that eluded us this last time? And so, I am quite concerned about the form and intensity of a future crisis, just as I am a little bit trepidatious about how effective Washington's potential efforts to manage it would be.
Yeah, it's going to be really high intensity, and it will unfold at the rung of the ladder where it ended last time.
Yeah.
As far as how effective Washington will be, will depend less on Washington and more on what kind of losses are suffered by either side. And so that will also determine how soon one or the other side asks for a ceasefire. That's where Washington will become more effective. But neither of us can look into the future, and we try as best as we possibly can to figure out what the hell is going on. I have long determined that as once they used to say in Ford Foundation, you go to a place for a day, you're an expert, stay there for a week, you're a specialist, and stay there for more than a month, and you're as confused as everyone else about what's going on. So I think we'll end on that note. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being on the program. This is all for this episode. Until next time, stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.